let us jump in and get started because there's much to say about Elijah. But before we begin, I'm assuming that some of you at least recognize what's here. All right. So when does one normally say Havdalah?
After Shabbat.
After Shabbat.
Yes, that was not a trick question entirely.
Oh,
Yeah.
and at the end of Yom Kippur.
Okay.
The end of any festival.
Right. So we do a more limited version of Havdalah when we are ending a festival, because on festivals, one is allowed to use fire. So we don't do that particular blessing, and we don't do the blessing for spices, but we do mark the transition from sacred time to ordinary time, if you will. And on Shabbat, we do the more expanded version of Havdalah, right? And the reason I ask when you do Havdalah, because it was like I said, it was not really a trick question completely, because you end the festival, you do Havdalah. You end Shabbat, you recite Havdalah. Right? But less known is the fact that even before we end Havdalah with this ritual, embedded into the Saturday evening Amidah, or the Amidah that we say on the evening after a festival, is in fact a paragraph which marks the transition from a time of holiness, such as Shabbat or festival, and the ordinary. And the quirky thing is this Havdalah ceremony, which then sort of marks the end of that service and the real transition into the next day and the next week, can actually be done as late as Tuesday, which feels very, very odd and very counterintuitive, because after all, if it's Tuesday and I've been doing all my regular stuff on Sunday and Monday, doing this feels at best, at best. Now, it was, the rabbis originally create this with the idea that someone may not have all of these various things with them on Saturday evening because they may be traveling, they may be doing any number of other possible things. And so they said, okay, get to where you're going, and then you can still do Havdalah and have the bonus, if you will, of doing all of these various mitzvot, which are very, very familiar. So I figured we're together, it's Sunday, we can still do Havdalah, and we're going to do Havdalah because what is the thing that we end Havdalah with?
Eliyahu Hanavi.
Eliyahu Hanavi, right? So the question becomes that we're going to look at is, why is Eliyahu part of our end of Shabbat ritual? Okay, but in the meantime, I figured we're going to talk about Havdalah, and we can still do Havdalah. We'll do Havdalah. Okay. Would you be good enough to hold that, please? And hold it over the plate. All right. Actually, I'm going to ask everybody to stand up. And where there's not so much wonderful light coming in through the windows, I'd say we turn off the overhead lights, but I don't think it will matter very much. And one can easily understand why this would make a really good nighttime activity and not so much a daytime activity. Well, this also apparently serves as a flamethrower. Okay, so if you could just hold on to that carefully. And if you could hold on to that carefully. And I forgot to get a cup of grape juice from the kitchen.
I'll run and get one.
All the other parts came from home, so I'm going like, oh, I'll just grab one of those when I get to shul, and then I didn't, even though I was in the kitchen.
This could set off the
Smoke alarm.
smoke alarms.
Well, let us hope not. We don't set, this is the candle we use on, at the end of Yom Kippur, and we haven't triggered the alarm yet. Though I realize the ceilings in here are lower than the ceilings in the sanctuary. Let's think positive thoughts. Oh, yeah, not sure where the smoke detectors even are anyway. Oh. Probably up there, but. Okay, so while we're waiting, I will just note that there are certain customs associated with doing Havdalah. One is when we do the blessing for spices, we'll give them a little bit of a shake and then we'll take the top off and everybody will pass it around. Everybody can take a deep inhale. And when we do the blessing for the fire, you might want to lean back a little.
Yeah, don't lean over too much.
It's customary to hold up one's fingers. The idea being that you're supposed to see the flame, the shadow sort of dancing between your fingers and the flame sort of dancing off your nails. It's a way of, again, it works much better in the dark because yeah, well,
A little bit. A little bit.
yeah, it helps a little, but
Mark, I should be stomping the grapes now.
we're just waiting on Martha to come back.
Yeah, she's coming.
She's coming. Excellent.
Here she is.
Here she comes to save the day.
Sorry,
That's okay. Thank you.
getting my exercise,
Awesome. Thank
not
you.
as bad as Wilton Road.
Yes, there are advantages to a more compact building. הנה אל ישועתי אפתח ולא אפחד, כי עוזי בזמרת יד עיני ויהי לי לישועה, ושפתם מים בששון ממעייני הישועה, לאדוני הישועה על עמך ברכתך סלע, אדוני צבאות עמנו משגב לנו סלע, אדוני צבאות אדוני יושיע מלך יעננו ביום קורנו, ליהודים הייתה אורה ושמחה וששון ועיקר כן תהיה לנו. כוס ישועות עשה בשם אדוני אקרא, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא מיני ושמים.
Amen.
Hey, give those give that a sniff and then pass it around.
Smell good. Sad.
Hey, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei meorei ha'esh. Yeah, that works. So not well in the middle light. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol ben or l'choshech ben Yisrael. Amin. Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol. Take that from you. And then carefully. Waste that good grape juice.
Yeah.
That's many things. Good is not one of them. And then, as I said, as we noted before, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishmi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hakilati, Imhera v'yameinu, Yavo Eleinu, Imashiach ben David, Imashiach ben David. Hold on a second.
Maybe I'll be appearing on screen today.
Yes, if I can get the cooperation of my computer. You can have a seat if you like. Uh,
Grab an animal.
Okay. So we end Shabbat, we mark the transition from sacred time to ordinary time. And one of the first things we do is we sing about Elijah. The question is, why? Why are we singing about Elijah?
Be Mashiach ben David.
Because what is,
He's the precursor.
so we start the week with this hopefulness that the harbinger of the Messiah will appear and announce that the Messiah is coming, in which case we'll enter into a universal utopian reality. Okay, that's very optimistic that the new week will be more positive perhaps than the one that we just left. But why and how does Elijah get this role? And who gives it to him? And when?
Mm.
And that's kind of what we're going to explore a little bit of today. When else do we invoke or acknowledge the presence of Elijah?
Brit Milah.
Okay, very good. At a Brit Milah. In fact, most of us don't have fancy ones like this, but there are many synagogues that have what is called a cathedra de Eliyahu, a kisei shel Eliyahu, a throne of Elijah. Right? And it is used during a Brit Milah, during a ceremony when we circumcise our male children on the 8th day. And even if we don't have such a fancy chair, there's always at a Brit Milah, a chair that is designated as the chair of Elijah. And sometimes it will have a pillow on it or some other designation, or sometimes it'll just be an empty chair. And as part of the process of bringing the baby into the room, the baby will be handed from the kvaterin to the kvater to the sandik. There's a whole string of people to whom the baby is passed. And when it gets to the mohel, either the mohel will place the child on the kisei shel Eliyahu, on the Elijah's throne, or he'll have the sandik do it. But the idea is that you're placing the child in the baby's lap, in Elijah's lap, excuse me. So the question is, okay, so this is another time when Elijah is thought to make an appearance. And again, the question,
Go on.
the question becomes, so why does Elijah show up at every bris and welcome the child onto his lap, sort of as the godfather, if you will, of the infant during the ceremony?
Because I just came up with this. So because maybe that baby that was just born is the Mashiach, and therefore now Elijah has to come and say, am I right?
Yes, actually, that is the part of the thought process, is that Elijah, who is supposed to be the herald of the Messiah, goes to every single Brit Milah in order to see, is this finally the one? Is this child going to grow up to be the Messiah? And do I need to start getting ready for my job as herald?
Also, during this Passover Seder.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we go to the Passover Seder, and I wasn't sure which order you were going to get those two in, so we're going to back up a slide. The question becomes, okay, so it's tied to his role as the herald of the Messiah, but we're still left with all those same questions of how did he get that job in the first place? Okay, and then this is the part of the Haggadah when we open the door and we announce that the hope that the Messiah will arrive and redeem the Jewish people from their tsuras. And okay, what does every child do?
Look to see if the wine moves.
All right, we tell, okay, Elijah comes and he takes a little sip of wine. Right now, in my household, this meant that I ran from the front door where I was sent to open the door back to the table, and amazingly, someone would always give the table a little wiggle and say, "See, the wine is moving a little bit in the cup." That was Elijah. You missed him. He just took a sip and he's on his way to the next place. Okay? Okay? Again, Elijah's role as herald of the Messiah comes into play here. And in fact, in this particular illustration, you'll see that there's a Jewish man holding a cup of wine in the doorway. And there's a family riding along on a white donkey. Why? Because the herald of the Messiah will enter Jerusalem riding on a white donkey, and right, so he's got this whole family that he's bringing with him. Right? And again, it's in that same role and capacity. Why not show up on Pesach?
Like, do you want to?
Because Pesach is the paradigmatic moment of divine salvation. Just as God saved us from Egypt and delivered us from slavery and from all the problems associated with Egyptian servitude and will bring us to the land of Israel, it becomes the paradigm of the future. Just as Moses came as God's agent, Elijah will come as God's herald to say the Messiah is coming, get ready. And so Passover becomes the annual moment of hopefulness. And so there you'll see a variety of illustrations of this scene in which Elijah appears. By the way, why is there an Elijah cup of wine? Right? By the way, are you noticing a trend here? He shows up at Havdalah where there's wine. He shows up at a Brit Milah where there's wine. He shows up on Pesach where there's wine.
So during the Seder, the cups of wine are symbolic of types of redemption of the Jewish people. And so Elijah, the Mashiach coming is seen as the kind of final redemption. Like you won't need more redemption, or it's like you can only use this deal once type of, like there's no redemptions after this. Like, only use this coupon once. So
Okay, you're kind of on the right track.
okay.
In the Torah, in chapter 6 of the book of Exodus, it mentions all sorts of different ways in which God will redeem the people. And the verses have five verbs to describe redemption. Right? How many cups do we normally drink on Pesach? Four. Those four reflect the first four steps of redemption, which happen, and the cup of Elijah represents the future, that last act of redemption, which will be complete and total. Right? So that's part of how the idea of a fifth cup came into being. It's not one that we drink, but it's one that is an expression of hope for the future. And in my household and in many households, an interesting variation of the custom has evolved. Normally, the cup of Elijah sits on the table, and you fill it before you start, so it sits there all the way through. the variant custom has it wherein before you get to this particular passage and you go to open the door, you pass the Elijah cup around the table, and each person puts some wine from their cup into the cup of Elijah in order to remind us that salvation doesn't happen completely without our input. That we have to make some contribution to the future. That if we want the world to be better tomorrow, then we have to do something today. And in some ways, it connects back to what our Israelite ancestors did. Not that they mimicked the same thing, but what did the Israelites have to do before the plague of blood? That's not the first plague, or the second plague, or the third plague. They don't have to do anything. That's just it. God does God's thing. You know, Moses warns Pharaoh before the first plague in a triad and the second plague in a triad, but third plague, there's no warning. The Israelites do nothing. They don't have to, it's not like God says, look, I'm about to smite the Nile and all the water in the land is going to turn to blood. Make sure you go to Costco and pick up some bottled water so you have. Right? No. Right? The Israelites have to do nothing until you get to the 10th and final plague, which is the precursor to the Exodus, because it's right after that the Israelites leave. And yes, they have to make a very bold statement of commitment that I am part of this community and I am willing to demonstrate my commitment to the community by putting blood on the doorposts, which will sort of identify me to the Egyptian and sort of ward off any adverse effects. But in some ways, it is, while God softens up Pharaoh and the Egyptians, the Israelites can't leave until they take some action on their own. And that's part of what this kind of is. And in some ways, I don't want to suggest that it undermines Elijah's role as much as it emphasizes the role that people have in the process of creating a messianic era. Okay, so we've looked at three very powerful occasions when Elijah appears. Most of them involve beginnings and transitions. The beginning of the new week and the hope for what the week will be. The beginning of the life of this child and what potential blessing the child can bring into the world. Can the child even be this ultimate messianic figure? And Passover is the echo of the original redemption with the hope that it will be usher in a future redemption. So these are all powerful moments of tradition, of transition. And in fact, there are all sorts of legends about how Elijah will show up to announce to a barren couple that they will have a child. Right? That he'll show up to save someone in a perilous situation, fraught with danger. Right? So again, moments of significant transition.
Elijah shows up in the competition with the priests of Baal. Am I remembering this correctly?
We're going to get to that story. We're going to get to that biblical story in just a moment. Right? So we're still we see the role and sort of the ubiquitous nature of Elijah in Jewish thought and tradition. But why? Okay, so what do we know about Elijah the prophet? And the answer is almost Bupkis. His first appearance in the Bible, in the book of Kings, he comes out of nowhere and confronts King Ahab, who's the king of the northern kingdom, and he announces, by the life of Adonai, God of Israel, whom I have served, there shall be no rain or dew these years except by my word. Okay? Draws a very hard line in the sand at God's command. And the question is, so where are you from? Who are you? Would I know your parents? And the answer is no. We think Elijah's parents are never introduced into the story. Right? There's some tradition that he's from the tribal area of Gad, which encompasses the area of Gilead. There are other suggestions that he's across the river and from the territory of Benjamin. You know, part of it reflects on, I'll say, the particular bias of the midrash or the rabbi who's writing as to whether you want to make Elijah a descendant of one of the Leah tribes or one of the Rachel tribes. Right? And it's fascinating because part of what you get is this whole line of explication and commentary about how Rachel mivaka al baneha, Rachel weeps for her children who are in exile. And people will routinely visit the tomb of Rachel in Bethlehem. And there's even a sign on the wall of a tapestry that says, I'm paraphrasing slightly, this was made and placed here by one of her children who returned. A very powerful image, except we are all, as either descendants of the tribe of Judah or the descendants of the tribe of Levi, we are Leah tribes. We're not Rachel tribes. And there's some who say, yes, well, the truth of the matter is that Benjamin was sort of swallowed up by Judah. So there's a bunch of Benjaminites mixed in with us. So the whole idea of Rachel weeping over children makes sense. But it reflects a bias that starts with Jacob in favor of Rachel and continues through history. But whether he's from God or Benjamin, what's important is that Elijah is a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. And it is with that population that he has moments of encounter, but he kind of comes out of nowhere, confronts the king, announces this decree from God, and then runs away. And he runs away because Ahab is trying to kill him. And I'm, let's be fair to Elijah. He doesn't run away just because he's running away. All right. So this is a fancy word, theophoric. Theophoric names are names that include an element of God's name. Okay. Yehoshua, right? And the Bible even tells us that his name was originally Hoshea, and Moses changes it by adding the Yah at the beginning because that's one of the divine names. All right, you've got Uziyahu, the who Yahoo at the end. Right? Then you've got a lot of El names: El Yakim, Yerachmiel, Riphael, Gavriel, Kalel. All right, Kalel's not biblical, but I couldn't resist throwing it in. For those of you who don't recognize it, that's Superman's Krypton identity.
More reflective of who made up some.
Indeed, I have no doubt that was not completely accidental on the part of Superman's creators. Right? But theophoric names are names which encompass and incorporate an element of the divine name as a source of either blessing, or sometimes even going to so for example, Riphael, God heals. Right? The names usually Yerachmiel, God comforts. Thank you. All right, so the names are in some ways evocative of an element or aspect of God, which we may want to see in the person we're naming, or it may just be a petition and prayer. Right? I introduced this whole idea of theophoric names because we have Eliyahu, right? There are two primary divine names, Elohim
Mhm.
and Adonai, what we pronounce as Adonai, which is written Yod He Vav He. Right? And the short part of Elohim is El, which means God. Right? The name Eliyahu, which means my God is Yod He Vav He, my God is, right, is the only one of these theophoric names that encompasses all the letters of the name of God. So it's a hint that there's something special, something unique about this guy. And in fact, in English, it's, or well, I guess technically in Latin, it's called nomen nomen. And in Hebrew, it's kishmo kenhu, which means that the person is as his name implies. Right? Years ago, in a previous congregation, we had an in-house caterer, and his supervision came from a rabbi whose family name was Lax, about whom I quoted this passage, Kishmo Kenhu. He is as his name suggests, because I went years without ever meeting him. Years and years, right? Now, how did that help how did that make kashrut work? It made me the essential person in charge of kashrut, because it's like, he can have his name on the piece of paper, I don't care, but this is my building and I'm going to supervise the caterer. And the caterer, and occasionally this guy would send people to sort of watch, and they knew nothing. They knew, it's like the caterer comes running to Rabbi, quick, come help me. I'm going like, what? This is the guy that lacks scent won't let me use cocoa butter because it's butter. And it's like, but it's marked Parov. I know it's like the same. And you checked it in, and I'm going like, yeah. Okay, let me go talk to him. Right. But so Kishmo Kane, who he is as his name implies, suggests something incredibly expective of Elijah in this case.
It's like a Darth Vader type of name. If people
You
get
mean
that.
like Dark Father?
Yeah. It describe, well, everyone seen Star Wars? Okay, right? Describe.
I saw Star Wars before you were born.
Yeah. I'm just making sure I don't want to ruin it. Okay.
Considering the first one came out in '79, I don't think you have to worry about spoiler alerts.
Some people haven't gotten to it yet.
But yes, the names often, especially if you pay attention to them and know what they mean, can sort of be like, oh, yeah, that was the great cinematic reveal. But if you were really paying attention, it's like, the clues were right there, including in the guy's name. But okay. So there's something that his name is telling us, because it's not just a name that includes the name of God, but it includes both names of gods in a way that no other name seems to. So if you know anyone whose name's Eliyahu, clearly his parents had oversized expectations. Okay, so I mentioned the fact that he comes out of nowhere to confront Ahav, King Ahab. Ahab is not known for his piety. All right, he's married to a queen named Jezebel, who is an import from one of the surrounding nations, and she brings with her all of her religious traditions and pagan practices. And Achav is pretty willing to go along. This upsets God, and he declares this period in which there shall be no rainfall. It may be punishing the king, but it has adverse effects on everybody. Okay. Including the woman that we're introduced to, the widow of Zarephath. God commands Elijah and says, go to this woman and invite yourself as a guest. And so he appears in Zarephath and he finds this woman and says, God told me to find you. Would you please make me something to eat? And she's looking at him like, are you insane? I have a little container of flour and a little jug of oil, neither of them full. I barely have enough to make for myself and my son, and you want me to make food for you? And he says, yes, but don't worry, it will be okay. And I don't know what she's thinking, but she does exactly what Elijah says, and she makes something for him, and then there's still more. And so she makes something for herself and her son. And Elijah promises that until God restores rain and crops begin to grow again, your jugs will never go empty. Very powerful image. And time goes by, Elijah's hanging out in this remote area, so Achab doesn't find him. And the woman's child takes ill, and she's going like, what's the deal? And he starts bringing the child, and he takes him up to his room, and he revives him with the miraculous and divine intervention. And then he brings the child back down. Okay, there he is, reviving him. And now he's returned and restored to his mother. Part of what it's introducing is Elijah's ability to perform or evoke miracles. All right. This is Elijah's big moment. After several years of famine and lack of rainfall, Elijah appears to one of Achab's stewards, a man named Obadiah, and says to him, go tell the king that I'm here. And Obadiah's going like, no, you're trying to get me killed. I'm going to go tell Achab that you're here, and the winds will carry you away. And so he already had this reputation as someone who could literally travel on the winds. And Elijah reassures him and says, no, this is the moment of confrontation. Tell Achav that he is to gather all the Israelites at the foot of Mount Carmel and gather up all of the priests of Baal and all of the priests of Asherah that Jezebel has introduced into the nation. And we're going to go mano a mano, so to speak. We're going to go face to face in confrontation. And so this confrontation is set up. And Elijah says, you know what? You guys go first. And so the priests of Baal start to scream and shout and gash themselves and do all sorts of things trying to get their god, Baal or Astarte, to send down a flame to consume what's on the altar. They're so confident, and this is captured in both a visual and written midrash. They're so confident that they hide a small child with a tinderbox under their altar,
What?
who is supposed to, when he hears them yelling and screaming and praying, he's supposed to light the altar from underneath,
Wow.
right? And you'll see that there's a snake, right? The snake, according to the midrash, bites the child and the child dies, so he can't light the flame, and the priests are yelling louder and louder, thinking that the kid fell asleep or something. Right? This happens to be a depiction of this pre-existing midrash, which appears in a synagogue in what is now Syria, in a place called Dura Europos. And I mean, and the synagogue there has depictions of many, not just biblical scenes, but incorporates midrashic scenes, where rabbinic interpretive scenes. Right. So this is the depiction of the scene with Elijah. Right. The priests of Baal and Astarte go on for hours and hours and hours. It's now getting closer to evening time, and Elijah basically says, okay, you know what? It's my turn. Let me see what I can do. And he builds his altar out of earth and stone, and then he puts the wood on top, and then he puts the offering on top. And then, just to make it more impressive, he takes huge jugs of water and pours it over the whole thing. And not just one, but multiple, and the water is just, teeming and pooling around this altar that he's created. After he does all that prep, he looks to the people who are gathered at the foot of the mountain and says, okay, are you finally, once I prove to you that God is really the power and that these other deities are frauds, are you finally going to stop jumping from pillar to post and commit yourself to God? And Elijah prays, and lo and behold, a fire descends from heaven and consumes the very sodden offering and the wood and the altar, and all the water goes whoosh. At which point the people all decree Adonai hu ha-Elohim. God is Lord. Right? Which, if that phrase sounds familiar, it's because it's what we say at the end of Yom Kippur. Right? Because it's the same sort of evocative idea that whatever we may have done prior to Yom Kippur that may have suggested a lack of fealty to God, Yom Kippur has given us this opportunity to transition into a better place and relationship with God, and therefore we declare Adonai hu Elohim. We come out of Yom Kippur with our faith, with our commitment restored and renewed. And there are various depictions of the scene. The more impressive the biblical scene, the more it captures the artistic mind, I think. And this is Adonai is the Lord. Adonai is the Lord. It's a much more modern scene, but with the same language, inspiring. Okay, and then the priests of Baal are put to the sword, and all is good, except for the fact that Jezebel is furious. And she yells at her husband to have Elijah put to death. And so Elijah, what does he do? He runs away again. This time he goes all the way to Mount Horeb, or something that passes for Mount Horeb. right? And he's in hiding there, but he's in isolation. And the Bible describes how while he's in hiding, birds communicate with him, and angels bring him food.
Wow, even back then, you could get DoorDash.
Well, some people could get DoorDash. Okay, so. And while he is there, he has. Okay, you see the water, the jug of wine, right? Oh, not at the chariot of fire. Right? God calls him out of his cave where he's hiding, and he hears loud sounds. He hears massive wind blowing, and it goes by. The whirlwind goes by, and it's not God. And there's fire, and God's not in the fire. And then he hears this still small voice. And God basically challenges Elijah and says, what are you still doing here? I need you in the fray. I need you out there. And he sends Elijah back. But the conversation includes a statement on Elijah's part that I've been so zealous for you, God, against the Israelites who forsook your covenant. They killed your prophets or allowed them to be killed, and I'm the only one left. And they're trying to kill me, and you want me to go back? And he says, yes, go back and appoint your successor. Right? And announces that Elisha is to become Elijah's successor. And then we get to not Chariots of Fire, the movie, but Chariot of Fire, right? In which Elijah is taken into heaven. So, what doesn't Elijah do? Doesn't die.
It doesn't really die.
Doesn't really die. Right? Now, have we ever seen something like this in the Torah or in the Bible before?
Like a chariot of fire?
Not specifically a chariot of fire, but someone who does not actually seem to die.
Well, Moses.
No.
No, it says he dies.
Yeah, he
So we don't know
dies, and
where
Moses
he's-
and God buries him at the top of the mountain, and nobody knows where his grave is. Yes, Enoch. Back all the way in like chapter 5 of the book of Genesis, we're told in this series of genealogies, so-and-so begat so-and-so and lived for a bunch of years and had a whole bunch of other so-and-sos, and then he died. And then it tells us what his oldest kid did. Right? And then we get to Enoch, and we're told that Enoch walked with God and was known. Taken. He is without the fiery chariot, but he seems to be removed from the world. Whereas about all the other characters in this list, it says, and they lived so many years and they died. Okay. That's why you have to read these lists carefully, because it's not, they're not interesting reading, but when they break their pattern, it's like, whoa. Right? So why not have Enoch do all the stuff that Elijah does? After all, Enoch walked with God, seemed to be a good guy. He was pious. He's so pious that God takes him into heaven. Well, here's the problem with Enoch. Enoch was adopted primarily by the Gnostics and then the church, and other sectarian groups. And the more they embraced Enoch, the more the rabbis said, no, 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 not him, not him. And in fact, the church often, there's some church writings in which they see Enoch as a precursor for Jesus. And the more explicit they become about that stuff, the less popular Enoch becomes in rabbinic circles.
Does that mean there's a point where you can see writings, rabbis being very positive about Enoch before you're like, nah?
There are some stuff about of a positive nature about Enoch,
Uh-huh.
and then they stop.
Okay.
And it's not a specific like, okay, members of the rabbinic council, let us take a vote on how we shall feel about Enoch. It doesn't
That's what
happen that way. It's a much more natural, gradual process about the more he is embraced over here, the more they are willing to let go of certain things and change certain things. Right? For example, do we recite as part of our normal morning service the Ten Commandments?
No.
No, we used to.
What?
Okay, why did the rabbi say no, 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 no? Is it that they don't like the Ten Commandments? No, I think they're very fond of the Ten Commandments, but
They were afraid that people would focus only on the Ten Commandments to the detriment of all the other commandments.
take it even a step farther, because there was already a faction within the Jewish community who were Judeo-Christians. All right, who were embracing Jesus as the messianic figure. And that leads to, eventually a split where Christianity just carves itself off from the Jewish community completely. And in Christianity, how many commandments do you have?
0.
Nope, not
No.
more than 0.
One.
Nope,
No, 11.
10.
10, right.
10.
But they're different.
Well, they're not that different. They're those 10, at least initially. And so the rabbis are going like, no, no, no. If we read these every day, people will come to the conclusion that Martha suggested, which is these are really important and the others, why? Because in Christianity or nascent Christianity is like these 10, observe these 10 and you're good. So the rabbis shied away from what had been normative practice because of the fear of misapprehension. So as Enoch is more and more embraced by sectarian and more marginal groups, the rabbis are going, we need a new herald, if you will. And isn't it convenient that we've got all of this Elijah stuff? And in some ways, the Elijah stuff is even more impressive, right? He's a miracle worker during his lifetime. He confronts authority and power. He is on the side of the people, and he's a herald and messenger of God. He's a much better version of Enoch, about whom we know very, very little. I'm not saying we know tons about Elijah, but we know even less. Okay? And so in rabbinic literature, you have this unanimous view that Elijah became immortal. Elijah lives and endures forever. He never tasted death, and rather he was translated body and soul into heaven or paradise with the ability to continue to operate in the human realm. So, yay, Elijah. And Elijah becomes this ongoing symbol. There are various versions of him going up. Sometimes they show Elisha left behind, sometimes not. right? And this one actually I like a lot, only because it's kind of in some ways very accurate, because
Looks like
Elisha was known for his baldness. So well, I appreciate when our artists and interpreters of text actually read the text and pay attention to it. Plus, what is falling from Elijah that eventually Elisha will pick up? His cloak, his mantle, all right? And it is both his symbolic mantle as prophet of God, and it's the cloak that Elisha will use both as a symbol of authority and in his work.
So here's something that just occurred to me. So Elijah's name incorporates both names of God.
Mhm.
And there's this decision, however it was made, that Enoch is not going to work. Here's Elijah. And Elijah's name incorporates God, and this is great. And we can have Elijah here, and they can have Jesus there. And if Jesus is according to these proto-Christians, God made manifest as a person, well, we'll have Elijah working the miracles, doing the great things, and then going up to God. And I'm thinking, maybe that's part of what is happening here, is that they've got him, we have Elijah.
Yeah, no, I think there may be some element of that. Part of, and while I presented it sort of in a process sort of way, some of it is happening simultaneously.
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, some of it is happening simultaneously. So the idea of Jesus as divine incarnation, is really not something that the Judeo-Christians are embracing. That's kind of after Paul, so after the year 200, whereas these guys are pre-200. And the idea of a miracle worker doesn't bother the rabbis. You know, they talk about different rabbis who performed miraculous feats, always attributing them to God. But you have all these stories about like someone like one of the most famous is Choni HaMa'agal. This guy named Choni used to draw circles, and he would compel, if you will, by his efforts, God to provide rain when there was a drought, right? And there are other examples of miraculousness that happen. So they're not shying away from humans being able to pull in God's power. But the challenge, if you will, is as the church makes Jesus more divine, the rabbis become increasingly uncomfortable, because the notion that you can have God in any human form is anathema. That's pagan. That's not Judaism. Whereas the idea that someone who was clearly human is, able to be preserved or have his, and I don't want to use this too loosely, but it's almost like, okay, we keep him flash frozen until we need him again.
Right.
All right. And then we thaw him out, send him down, and he does his thing. Right? It doesn't work completely because, he's constantly going to brisses and other things. But it's this idea that the miraculousness of Elijah is not that he's divine incarnate. He's not God. He's a herald of God. He's a messenger of God. He's a person who is just able to live forever by divine power. But there's not a sense that Elijah is more divine than any of us. In fact, one could argue that Elijah's role as it morphs becomes much more in tune with what we could do. So let's look at Elijah as he sort of becomes, right? But one of the things that I want to just, before we leave the biblical period is, or this part of the biblical period, Elijah is zealous. In some ways, he's angry on behalf of God, but he's angry, right?
It's like, I'm at the restaurant to get my order wrong. I'm like, it's fine, I'll just have this. And then my mom's like, no, you have to speak up. And then she'll wave down the waiter. I'm like, oh no. Oh no, I don't want to deal with this. It's a whole big fight. It's like,
Okay. I'm not sure if I would have come up with that one, but yes, it's like, when do you allow your anger to come out? And how do you address situations? And Elijah is angry dude. All right. If I was going to put it in very contemporary terms, Elijah has elements of Red Hulk. Those of you who get that reference, fine. Those of you who don't, it's okay. But what happens to Elijah? Well, let's see. Another example. Okay. In fewer weeks than some of us would like to acknowledge, it will be the Shabbat just before Pesach. And on the Shabbat just before Pesach, we will read the Haftarah, which comes from the book of Malachi. Malachi has the distinction of being the last of the prophets. And he operates during the early Second Temple period, not long after the return from Babylonian exile and the beginnings of the rebuilding of the temple. Okay? And toward the end of the Haftarah, it says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming, the great and terrible day of the Lord. What is this great and terrible day of the Lord?
Great and terrible. Great as in
Huge.
of huge, or great is like that's a great thing.
Huge.
Because like you can't be great and
huge, overwhelming, all-encompassing.
Okay.
Awe-inspiring.
Okay.
Nora.
Okay.
This is one of my favorite Haftarah.
Okay.
It's about Armageddon.
Oh no.
It's about the transformational moment of the world. And why am I sending Elijah to you before that day? Because what's Elijah's role becoming? It isn't there yet. Remember, we said it before, but this is where it starts. Elijah is the herald of that moment of transition. The cataclysm that is about to happen will end with a utopian reality and a messianic era. Okay? Malachi, somewhere in the 400s, hints at that idea. Doesn't, So one of the roles of Elijah, go back a second, is the herald of the Messianic era. And we saw how that plays out in all sorts of ritual ways for us today. Okay? Role number 2, Teku. I think that's, you can see I couldn't decide how to spell it. Because it's transliterations are just not my thing. Okay, Teku is an acronym that means Elijah will come and resolve all of our questions and difficulties. Right? It's a term that appears in the Talmud quite often, right? And it is at the end of a discussion amongst the sages where they cannot decide what to do about something. It happens sometimes in monetary matters where a dispute about some monies will come up and they can't decide. So they say, okay, we're going to take all of the money that's being argued about, and we're going to put it in an escrow account. No, I'm not kidding. We're going to put it over here. And when Elijah comes, he'll decide and resolve the question. Right? And they use the same thing in non-monetary matters as well. They'll say, they'll have the lengthy debate, discussion, and then they'll say, Teku, Tish, and they read it as an acronym as Tishbi, meaning the Tishbi Yavo will come.
Mhm.
The Kushiot, Uvayot, the Yitarets. I don't remember the last word now. I'm blanking on it. It's one of those where I should have written. I was like, I don't need to write this down. But it's the idea that he'll come along and he'll resolve all of these outstanding questions of law, so that we can, in fact, go forward into this into the future, knowing how to observe what God wants. And then we're back to Malachi, the last verse of the Haftarah, which before we repeat the penultimate verse again, because we read verse 23 twice in its order, and then again at the end. Elijah is the one who will turn the heart of fathers to the children and the heart of children to their fathers. It presumes that there's tension in family life that requires reconciliation. And you can also read it on a more macro scale of generational conflicts and tensions. Okay? But Elijah will come along to bring harmony and tranquility and understanding. Right? It's a different manifestation of the same idea of this utopian reality. This is all now Elijah's job description, but Malachi is sort of the one who introduces at least 2/3 of it. This is from one of the other places where we invoke Elijah.
Hazan et Hakol.
All right, so Hazan et Hakol is a hint to what prayer? Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals. And what do we say? Harachaman hu yishlach lanu et Eliyahu hanavi zachur latov. All right, we pray for God to send us Elijah the prophet, gratefully zachur latov, may his memory be for good. Vivaser lanu besorot tovot. Right? And he should bring us good tidings of consolation and comfort, because what does Elijah bring? He's the herald of the Messiah, which means that he's going to bring us good news, and we say this every time we do Birkat Hamazon. And in fact, it's one of the passages of the series of Harachamans that most people sing. I'm not one of them usually. I'm not a big messiness. Which makes this kind of ironic, but it's this idea that it's not just in the infrequence, the annual Pesach, the occasional family event of a Brit Milah. It's not even on the weekly level of Shabbat, but it's on that day-to-day basis that I'm constantly hoping for Elijah. No, okay, I'm going to skip over these. Oops. I thought there was one at the end of that. Okay, so just examples of other chairs of Elijah. I tucked them at the end because I didn't think we needed more than one. Okay, so what happens in between? We've got this idea, and all of a sudden, Elijah becomes a ubiquitous presence in Jewish folklore and folk tradition. He shows up everywhere and all the time. There are abundant stories of how he shows up to help people, usually almost always in disguise. One of his favorite disguises is as either a beggar or a poor person, and how you treat him will determine how you are blessed. So
Like a Rorschach.
it's kind of a Rorschach test. I mean, so I'll give you two examples of stories about Elijah that sort of play off of this idea. This one first. Okay, so by the way, Elijah appears not just throughout time since then, right? But everywhere, right? There are stories of Elijah appearing to the sages to teach them stuff. Right? There's a whole legend around Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Shimon Bar Yochai lives in the 2nd century of the Common Era in the land of Israel. And the author of the Zohar, who lives about 1,000 years later in Spain, attributes the Zohar to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai because he recognizes that it's such an outrageous book that he's got to put it, quote unquote, in the mouth of someone authentic and authoritative whose bona fides will not be questioned. And in the legend of Shimon Bar Yochai, he and his son are banished to a cave. And who shows up to take care of them? Elijah shows up, and he creates a miracle so that there's a spring of water to provide them with water, and this tree grows to provide them with nourishment. And he shows up to study Jewish mysticism with them. So I want to fast forward now, and we are now in the town of Salonika, which is in Greece. And it's a story of a man who has nothing. One day, in the week before Pesach, the man goes for a stroll on the beach. And he's reflecting on all his troubles and all his problems, and the fact that he has not the wherewithal to procure the things necessary to make a Pesach Seder. And he's trying to figure out what to do, but he has no clue. He is approached on the beach by none other than the angel of death. Yeah, not Elijah. And the angel of death is disguised initially and says, you seem kind of sad. What's wrong? My house is empty. I have not the wherewithal to make Pesach. And the angel of death sort of drops his disguise and says, listen, I'll make a deal with you. I will give you 100 gold dinar. Go prepare a beautiful festive Pesach for your household. But know that as soon as you bless the first cup of wine, I will arrive at your house and ask you 3 questions. If you answer them well, you'll stay alive. If you can't answer them, then I will take your life and the money. The guy thinks for a moment, goes like, it's not a good deal, but I have no recourse. I have no choice. I have to do this because otherwise I can't make Pesach. And so the angel of death gives the money to the man. The man goes home and explains to his wife where the money came from. And she's going like, are you sure it was such a good idea to agree on these conditions? And he's going, look, Pesach is supposed to be a festive holiday. We have nothing. let's at least try. We'll make Pesach, and who knows, maybe God will provide help so that I'll be able to answer the questions and not die. So, fast forward, is now the night of Pesach. They're seated around the table, and they're doing everything except saying Kiddush, the blessing over the first cup of wine. All of a sudden, there's a knock on the door. Man opens the door. He's a beggar. Beggar says, "May I join you for Seder?" And the man says, "Of course." And he brings him in, and they make a place for him, and they make him feel welcome. And he's sitting, and he's noticing that they're not making Kiddush. And he's finally, after a while, says, "Is there a reason you're not making Kiddush? After all, everything is set, and the wine is poured, and blah blah blah. And what's up?" And the man's, eventually explains, and he says, "Listen, I'm here. I'll take care of it. You make Kiddush." Makes Kiddush, and as soon as he finishes making Kiddush, there's a knock at the door. And the beggar says, "You sit, I'll go to the door." All right? And from the inside of the door, Elijah never opens the door, but he engages the angel of death, who figures out that it's Elijah, and eventually gives up and goes away. And the man is left with his life and all of that. And as soon as the angel of death disappears, so too does the beggar. It's very typical of an Elijah story, where he steps in to help someone in order to sort of balance the scales of justice. But what was it that the gentleman and his wife and his family did? They welcomed this poor person into their house. By the way, there are any number of stories where it goes differently. So there's another one where sort of starts off the same way. Poor couple, a beggar comes along and says, can I have some food? And they say, sure. They take him in and treat him very nicely. And the beggar sort of reveals himself as Elijah and says, "I'll give you 3 wishes." And so first they wish for a bigger house, and then they wish for beautiful clothes, and then they wish for great wealth. And with each wish that they make, Elijah whistles, and poof, their hovel becomes a mansion, their clothes become magnificent, and this huge pot of gold appears. Fast forward, Elijah comes back again in disguise and goes up to the gates of the mansion and says, "I'd like to see the master of the house." And the guardkeeper says, "No, go away." And Elijah says, "No, he'll remember me from before." And the guard is not impressed, and he goes and he starts to bring the dogs over to get rid of the beggar. So what do you think? What's happened? The guy has transformed, right? And he hears the guy hears the commotion, comes outside, and part of he's going like, he's going to recognize the beggar, and it's going to no. He does not recognize the beggar, does not acknowledge his need, and says, "Just go away or we'll turn the dogs on you. And Elijah whistles 3 times and the money disappears, the beautiful clothes disappear, the mansion disappears, at which point the man realizes that he has betrayed what made him worthy in the first place. And then I'm going to end with this story. And this one is set in Baghdad. Right? I just want you to appreciate, you've got the Sephardic world, you've got the Arab world, you've got the Ashkenazic world. Elijah is everywhere. I mean, we know that he can be everywhere because he visits everybody for Seder, but these stories are from everywhere around the Jewish world. And it's a story about a young man who studied Torah and was pious and performed mitzvot and gave tzedakah to the poor, and he marries a woman from the community who was also very kind and very generous, and they routinely offered hospitality to people who came to their door. And unfortunately, they were not able to have children. And this went on, and they were watching all their friends have children and walk around with babies in their arms, and this was crushing for them. And they would try to encourage each other and support each other, and they became increasingly more reclusive because they saw how people were looking at them with sort of a certain amount of sympathy, but also with a what's wrong with them kind of look. And so Pesach comes around, and there's a knock on your door. You know where this is going. And the husband gets up, opens the door, and they see this old man who they invite to come in and join them for Seder. And when the old man, when the Seder's over and the old man gets up to leave, they say, it's late, why don't you stay the night? He's going like, no, I must go. Okay? And before he goes, he offers them not a thank you, but the following. I have asked the Holy One that I merit to visit you next year for Pesach and join you for the Seder, and that your table will be filled with disorder.
What?
A very odd way to leave. And the couple are quite astonished by, they're figuring, okay, he'll say thank you, whatever he's going to say, and we didn't do it so he would say thank you, but let him. But this is weird. This feels more like a curse than a blessing. But the man goes off, and lo and behold, sometime not long thereafter, the woman discovers that she's pregnant. Triplets. Not in this version of the story, but the beauty of stories like this is that they could, and in fact, triplets would really emphasize the way the story is going to end, right? And so after 9 months, they have a child, and the child starts to grow, and poof, it's Pesach again. And they're sitting at the table for the Seder, and there's a knock at the door, and lo and behold, it's the same old man. And they welcome him again, and they bring him to the table. And what's the reality of the table? Right? Like any parent with little kids knows, the kid reaches out for the shiny goblet and knocks it over, or pulls on the tablecloth and things fall over, and it's a disaster. And the couple are still overjoyed because they're new parents and they're watching their little kid do all the things that little children do. And they realize that what they had thought was not such a nice blessing was in fact a real blessing. And that, and they, and they turned to the old man and said, we need to apologize. Why do you need to apologize? Well, because when you left, we thought that your words were not so nice, but we now understand that what you gave us was a real blessing. And the man says, you don't have to thank me. And I pray that your child will be like you, someone who studies Torah and lives Torah and is filled with compassion and kindness for other people. And then he does what Elijah does. Poof. But these are the Elijah stories, one by one, intervening not on the macro scale, but to bring some measure of blessing and hope into the lives of ordinary Jews, but partly because us ordinary Jews invite Elijah in all the time, at the end of Shabbat, at the end of a meal, at the Pesach table, and in so many other times when we look forward to his arrival as a herald of a better day.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if there are questions, I'm happy to entertain them.